gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. McDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Dr. M. David Litwa with us again today. And Dr. Litwa, I'm not going to waste any of your time. I've asked many scholars, Elaine Pagels, Dennis McDonald, Richard Carrier, Robert Price. And then the list can go on and on. I've asked Dr. Bart Ehrman. You know, the list goes on. And I have to pitch it to you. Is the secret gospel of Mark a forgery? And also, if you don't mind, educate us a little bit on what you found out.
Well, I really appreciate you asking, Derek, because my current book project is a book on Carpocrates. Now, Carpocrates is one of those early Christian thinkers that the church fathers didn't like, so they de-Christianized him, called him a Gnostic, and basically forgot about him, or wanted other people to forget about him. But Carpocrates was an amazing early Christian thinker. One of our first theologians, had two students. One of them was his own son. Another was a lady named Marcellina, who led a church in Rome and was the only known female leader of a church in Rome in the 2nd century that we know of. So it was a very popular Christian movement. What happened in 1958 was that a letter was discovered, some people think it was planted, in which we learn more about Carpocrates. And in this letter, it said that Carpocrates, who was in Alexandria, basically tricked a local presbyter or priest or pastor, as it were, by magical arts into bringing him a version of the Gospel of Mark, which I'll just call Mystic Mark, which was or sometimes called Longer Mark, which was only used in Alexandria, and that Carpocrates got a hold of this, and that he not only used this for his community, but that he actually made some insertions which seemed scandalous to Clement of Alexandria, who's the late 2nd century early Christian writer, who supposedly writes this letter called the Epistle to Theodore. So I assume that your readers know about that much, and they probably also know that this manuscript has more or less disappeared under what I consider to be fairly suspicious circumstances. It's at least not at all lucid why we don't have the manuscript. And if we did, we could probably within about a month determine its authenticity, because we could put the ink under the microscope and do all sorts of tests and so on and so forth. Since we don't have the manuscript, we have to depend on the internal content of it to see if we find the hand of a forger. And basically, what I'm interested in is, can we, this document is supposedly written in the late 2nd, possibly early 3rd century. Can we determine if the document depends on stuff that's later than that? And I think that we can, because the church historian Eusebius is the only early Christian writer that survives that tells us that Mark actually wrote, or that Mark, that is the so-called gospel writer, came to Alexandria. No other source that we have says that. But it's also what this Epistle to Theodore says. So it's somewhat suspicious, and it raises the question, did the author of the Epistle to Theodore read Eusebius? And if he did read Eusebius, that's a problem, because Eusebius is early 4th century, which is more than 100 years after the letter was supposedly written. So that's a big question. And basically, my sense of it is that whoever wrote the Epistle of Theodore definitely did know Eusebius, because the detailed knowledge of Eusebius is very clear in the letter. First of all, the fact that Mark goes to Alexandria, that's only known from Eusebius. The author of the Epistle to Theodore also uses this, also calls Mystic Mark a more spiritual gospel. This is exactly or similar to a phrase that Eusebius uses to refer to the Gospel of John, that is a spiritual gospel. Now, interestingly, Eusebius, in making known these traditions, seems to be dependent on Clement, but I don't. I think what's going on here is that Eusebius isn't actually dependent on Clement for the information that Mark goes to Alexandria. Eusebius is dependent on Clement for the information that Mark writes the Gospel of Mark in Rome, but not for the fact that he goes to Alexandria. What I see the author of the Epistle of Theodore doing is solving some very modern problems. One of them is the question, who's the beloved disciple? Now, if we were to take a time machine and go back into antiquity and ask this question, I'm not sure they would have thought that this was a very pressing issue. Most ancient church writers, that is, identified the beloved disciple as John, son of Zebedee, and sort of left it at that. But whoever wrote the Epistle to Theodore wants to really solve this problem, and he basically says that it was actually Lazarus, but without the name Lazarus, because of course Lazarus comes from the Gospel of John, but basically it's the same character of Lazarus. It's the guy who was Jesus raised from the dead before Jesus himself rose from the dead. So there's this weird attempt to solve what I think is a fairly modern problem. That is, who actually is the beloved disciple. Another interesting problem the Epistle of Theodore tries to solve is how Mark can write both before and after Peter died. Because according to early tradition, Mark wrote his gospel in Rome, but some later Christians thought that he also wrote his gospel in Alexandria, and that's John Chrysostom thinks that. And the question is, did he write it before or after Peter died? Did he write it before Peter died in Rome or after Peter died in Alexandria? And actually, the ancient writers disagree on this. And one could read Eusebius to mean to say that, well, he actually wrote his gospel in Alexandria. Well, lo and behold, the Epistle of Theodore solves this problem, which is, again, a very modern problem. It was never really raised in the ancient world as a problem. And he says that he wrote actually two gospels. One he wrote in Rome and one he wrote in Alexandria. And the Alexandria one is the longer gospel. And that's the more mystic gospel. And bada bing, bada boom, there we go. And the problem is solved. But again, that's rather suspicious because that's a very modern problem. Now, I went back and I checked on Morton Smith's knowledge of Eusebius, and another scholar that's been doing some of this work is Grant Adamson from Arizona. And basically, I checked to see how much Morton Smith knew of Eusebius, and it turns out that he knew quite a bit of Eusebius. And the reason why I checked this is because whoever wrote the Epistle of Theodore had to know, I think, Eusebius pretty well. So either you've got two options. One option is that you say it's an ancient forgery of someone who knew Eusebius in the ancient world, or it's a modern forgery of someone who knew Eusebius in the modern world. And because I think the letter is designed to answer modern questions in biblical studies, I tend toward the modern forgery view based on the content. I think if we had the actual manuscript, that would also be confirmed by the ink and by microscopic analysis of the writing. But since we don't, we have to depend on the internal stuff. And I think Morton Smith had all the abilities to write the letter. And then the question is motive. and people have run into circles about psychologizing Smith and all of that. I think Smith was a great scholar. I love reading Morton Smith. I think he's just fun to read.
Yeah.
And I also think that he's quite capable of thinking that, as I was talking to you in the former episode, that history really isn't the gauge on religious truth. I think that he whether or not he was trying to dupe his teachers, some of whom he did, in any kind, I don't think he was hostile, but I do think that he had this overall sense that truth isn't based on history. So you can produce a modern apocryphon and it can still be true, just in the almost in the same sense as the ancient gospels are true, because the only thing that separates them is time. And time or history doesn't really matter in the game of religious truth. So bada bing, bada boom.
Yeah, I mean, we got Islam in the 7th century, and it's utilizing previous ideas from Judaism and Christianity. And you go, well, if we've looked at this and I see holes in the way that people understand this, why are you? And it's like, that doesn't matter to them. They don't care that it was 7 centuries after Christianity. It's truer than all of the stuff. In fact, you guys messed up back there. But no, this is an interesting point I want to ask about the psychologizing before we let up on this question. Some people have said, and I don't know, I really want to read Morton Smith. I think it's Morton Smith that talks about the magical Jesus, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
I'm interested in hearing how he does that and what he thinks about it. But from what I understand, he himself was a homosexual. Now, I don't mean anything bad by this. I have very good friends that are. And he himself was finding a way somehow, some people were projecting this, to have the naked young man running, if you will, out as a secret lover, that it somehow projects his modern potential desires. Now, you probably don't go that far and say, no, I'm not going there. But have you heard anyone say that kind of stuff to try and like put that in there?
I have never heard. I may have heard rumors of it in Peter Jeffrey's book that Smith was a closet homosexual, but I've never seen that actually confirmed, and I rather doubt it.
Right.
And I would be very hesitant of spreading that as a report. I don't think that can be confirmed. I think Smith strikes me as someone, who I don't know what happened in his personal life, and
Right.
I would be very hesitant. But in terms of the literary stuff, you raise an important point that again makes me suspicious about the letter. That is, whoever is writing the letter is trying to explain. Whoever's writing Secret Mark or Mystic Mark, whatever you want to call it, is trying to explain that young man running away naked in the Garden of Gethsemane in Mark 14:51 and 52. So then you ask yourself, well, was that an ancient problem? I mean, did the ancients actually have that as a question? Or is that more of a modern problem? And I would definitely, again, say that's much more of a modern problem, because we've, in 20th century scholarship on Mark, boy, if you run a search for all the stuff written on Mark 14:51 and 52, which is that naked guy running away in the Garden of Gethsemane, holy smokes, you're going to be dead before you finish all that literature. But when you look into the ancient world, they don't seem to be altogether that interested.
Yeah.
So who's ever writing Secret Mark is much more in the modern world than they are in the ancient world. And they're trying to solve these modern biblical, what we call crux interpretum, that these huge problems in modern biblical studies.
Yeah.
And I think it's funny. I mean, I think it's fun. And you should, and Morton Smith, as I understand, had a great sense of humor.
Yeah.
I hope that's not that's about as far as into psychologizing as I'm ready to go.
No, I get it. And I meant no disrespect by that. I'm simply relaying what I've heard. But if it were true, it could make a lot of sense of, like you're saying, modern issues that we see in the church, and of course with what's going on, it would make a lot of sense. I hold no judgment on someone's lifestyle like that. I'm just pointing out that could that play a role in the reason, and it could if it was true. But I don't know. That's a good point. You're right. We shouldn't start with that as something we would use. You approached it the right way, I think, going to the literary and looking in there. So. Thank you.
And if I could just say one point, the reason why I think because I'm approaching this from the direction of Carpocrates and understanding the historical Carpocrates, so to speak, who's a fantastic Christian thinker. He's wildly imaginative, believes in transmigration. He's accused of being licentious. He's accused of having these sex orgies. He's accused of using magical practices. And what's interesting is who's ever writing the letter to the epistle to Theodore just basically accepts all this heresiological trash that's bad-mouthed about Carpocrates, that he was this lewd magician. And so then the question is, does this have anything whatsoever that will help us understand Carpocrates? And the short answer is no, not really, because it just contributes to that heresiological portrait of Carpocrates. Whereas in fact, if you're really interested in Carpocrates, and you should be interested in these Gnostic Christians, because their view of Jesus is just wild and fun and crazy, you can get to the historical Carpocrates, but you've got to peel away all this heresiological trash that's been spoken against him like he's some kind of licentious nutcase. And that, once you get rid of that, you can really start understanding the great Wild West of early Christianity and how fun it actually is. Mm-hmm. So for those interested in Secret Mark, I would urge you, get interested in Carpocrates, because the Carpocrates you see in Secret Mark is only repeating the Carpocrates in the heresiological literature. And what you really need to do is peel behind that heresiological literature to get us to an actual Carpocrates who really is worth studying.
Interesting. We might have to do a follow-up where you can go into this more. I'm excited to hear what you've found about him. So, ladies and gentlemen, go get the books, How the Gospels Became History. We just did an episode on that, and we have more books that I do want to cover of yours. And you touch on a lot of stuff, like a lot of books that you have written. I ask everybody to go into the description and check it out for sure. Buy the books, and also go to his blog. He's got it here. He's just published this one. We're going to do an episode on that next, The Evil Creator. And, we're not doing too exhaustive. You need to read the work. But at some point, we might do some follow-up episodes going into some more of his work. So make sure you go down in the description. Check him out. Thank you, Dr. Litwa. I appreciate you on the Secret Gospel, Mark.
Thanks very much.
We are MythVision.